Hello, everyone. Welcome to Science versus Bullshit. Or was it Bullshit versus Science? Anyway, either way, we're here. The whole point in this series is to demystify fat loss and getting fit and healthy and not wasting a ton of money on supplements and all the confusing things that you hear about online. So if you're confused about supplements, perimenopause, cortisol, fasting, hormone imbalances, you are in the right place. Most of what we're going to cover today, although I'm open to any questions that anybody has, and that's the whole reason for this being live, by the way, is that I want it to be interactive and go back and forward with people and what you guys actually want to know about, as opposed to most podcasts that's like obviously one directional because you just listen to me and then you don't get to ask stuff back. So that's the rationale between it being live and normally I just record these. Hopefully that's useful to people, but I'm going to test it. I'm going to test it for like, I don't know, maybe 3 months or something, do one a week. Oh, that's quite a long time. 2 months, do one a week. If it doesn't seem to work, then I'll probably just go back to podcasts. If people like it, I'll keep it like this. So this one's going to be focused on hormones. This will come up a lot because there's a lot to break down, but I am just going to walk to the other side of the room to get a drink. Hold on. I was having too much fun and then I realized, oh my God, it's 6 p.m. And and thank you to everyone who's come live on your Sundays. I mean, that's real dedication. Okay, so any questions that people have going along, fire them away. And I have collated some of the most common myths around hormones and fat loss and what people are told about hormones online and whether you should be avoiding cortisol and what that means and if you need to change the way that you're training and if that changes during perimenopause and fat distribution and all of this kind of stuff. Fortunately, I was able to do this from one horrendous post which like just had so many bad claims. I was like, oh great, and my research for this is going to be pretty simple. I don't know. Okay, well apparently we already have an issue with something on the YouTube chat, but I don't know how to moderate that, so I'm just gonna ignore that for now. But thank you, Leanne, for pointing that out. Emily, we are all being naughty. We should be in church. Surely not, church isn't at 6 p.m. on a Sunday. Anyway, right. First myth is that belly fat is caused by high cortisol levels from stress. And this has like numerous levels of misinformation within it. Now, it is true. So there is, most of these you'll find have a pattern, right? There's like a little bit of truth in them, which has been completely misplaced. So it is true that chronic stress, so prolonged periods of time where you have high cortisol, can influence fat distribution. And I'm going to come on to this, but it's certainly not the sole cause of quote unquote belly fat. And to like kind of claim that it's cortisol that's causing this is, in a word, wrong. It will always be a calorie surplus. And like I said, where you store fat can be impacted by cortisol, but you normally see this in really severe conditions in regards to cortisol, like Cushing syndrome, or very, very severe chronic stress. And it's actually much, much, much less likely, not just because you feel stressed and thus you're kind of just assuming that your cortisol levels will be high and that's why you've put on fat in a certain part of your body. Like that is a huge, huge leap. One of the issues with blaming cortisol is that it fluctuates so much. Now, the first issue being no one ever tests you for this, right? When I say no one, like maybe if you have a serious reason for it and you go to the doctors, but these influencers that are trying to sell you things, they never test it. They're just like, oh, if you feel stressed, I'm going to assume that you have chronically high cortisol levels and then diagnose you with this problem that you don't have and sell you a solution to that. That's where a lot of the misinformation comes from. Mostly quote unquote belly fat comes from like poor diet, overeating, inactivity, your genetics to a certain extent, maybe some age-related changes in your hormones, but most likely not because of cortisol. And what else did I want to say on this? I think something to hammer home when anybody talks about cortisol, because this is a thing that comes up all the time, is that most people who talk about cortisol really don't understand how it actually works. And they have this big leap between just feeling stressed and having high cortisol levels, which when you look at the research isn't necessarily true. So it's a much bigger correlation between cortisol levels and acute stress. So that might be things like exercise or public speaking, where people feel very stressed. Then there is quite a big correlation between perceived stress in the moment and cortisol levels. But where you see that less is what most people are talking about, which is like chronic stress. So even in states where, I don't know, whether it's like extremely busy at work, or whether it's because you're a new mother, or whether it's because you're caring for somebody, like really high stress situations, what you often find is lower levels of cortisol. And part of that is because you end up having this like dampened response to stress when you're chronically stressed. So if people are arguing that like high cortisol levels are a bad thing, and that because you feel stressed all the time you have high cortisol levels, that might actually be the inverse of that, might actually be happening. And then there's other evidence, which I think is really interesting, that shows that people who exercise more frequently, in fact, I think this particular study was an acute response. So they have people do HIIT training, which is very stressful on the body, and then they expose them to psychological stress. And the people who had done HIIT training before the psychological stress responded better to the psychological stress, even though in theory, if you listen to these influencers, et cetera, where they're like really simple with cortisol equals bad, and if you already feel stressed, then doing things like HIIT training is the worst thing you could possibly do. Actually, that doesn't really play true. If you're someone who is struggling with things that are inherently chronically stressful, then doing things like high intensity interval training or exercise in general is probably going to help you deal with that stress better, not worse. Let's see what the comments say here. For people with PCOS, are there much changes we should be making? For my clients with PCOS, I haven't really had to change much, but I appreciate I might be missing something. They've had success with fat loss with generally non-negotiables in terms of nutrition and exercise. Yeah, on paper, no. There are certain situations where you might want to consider slight changes. For example, a lot of the things that people with PCOS are often told not to do are actually the best things they can do. Prime example being HIIT training. The only real consideration that I would make, aside from the fact that everyone is a human, everyone is different, everyone will experience their PCOS symptoms slightly differently, or they might also be linked to other things, or sometimes people have worse menstrual cycles or irregular menstrual cycles. So all the kind of nuances around that and just dealing with a person. But when it comes specifically to the PCOS, one thing that does occur with many women with PCOS is insulin resistance, even when lean. So there might be a few tweaks that you could make. So for example, a lower carb diet may be useful. And things that are going to increase insulin sensitivity, like all the things that you'd already be doing in Kanchan, right? So like having someone resistance train frequently, having someone do some fitness type work, maybe some HIIT training in there as well, because that's all going to increase insulin sensitivity. And then we used to think that women with PCOS had quite a dampened metabolic rate, but that's actually now been shown not to be true. So there used to be this idea that you'd probably have to put them in you'd probably have to put them in on lower calories to create the same deficit as somebody without PCOS, but that's now been shown not to be the case, and there really shouldn't be that much impact from that respect. When you come back to insulin resistance, another thing that can happen is because you're resistant to insulin, and one of the many things that insulin does is reduce your appetite. So basically, when you eat, insulin is released in order to store glucose. safely, right? So then it goes into either your muscle or your fat, so it's not around in the blood glucose levels and then elevating blood glucose levels, which can be toxic, and that would be a hallmark of type 2 diabetes. So we definitely don't want that. So in a healthy individual, you eat some food, glucose goes up, insulin responds, and then it safely stores glucose. The other thing that insulin does is signals to the body a few things, which I won't go into, but one of them is, hey, look, there's food here. There's energy available here. Guess what? You probably don't need to eat more. Thus, we're going to reduce hunger. So what you can find with people who are insulin resistant is that their normal hunger response to food is slightly changed. So it could be that someone with PCOS might find that sticking to a deficit is a little bit harder. Things that you would do with that are, again, this kind of same basic things you would do with anyone who struggles with hunger. Make sure you're getting in enough protein and make sure that you're looking at food volume as well. And then the other thing that I'd consider with PCOS, especially if someone is trying to get pregnant and they're struggling with fertility, is meal timing. And that's because there's a few studies on time-restricted eating that have some pretty incredible results with not actually changing the amount that somebody eats, but just changing when their biggest meal of the day is. So one particular study changed the biggest meal of the day from, in one group, it was breakfast, and they were like the front-loading calorie group. And in one group, it was dinner, and they were like the back-loading calorie group. And the group that ate the same, but ate most of their calories in the morning, found that they had much better response. They increased their fertility significantly more. And I can't remember the exact stats on this. I'm not going to lie and make them up, but it was really impressive, the amount of people that got a regular cycle back in comparison to the group that were eating in the evening. So if anyone wants to know more about that, I did a full podcast on it. So if you're listening to this, message me on Instagram at ESG Fitness and just say, I'd like the PCOS podcast, and I'll send you it. And that has my brain where I remember every single part of that study and the reference for it as well. So you can go and have a listen to that. But I find that part of it really interesting, and is one reason that time-restricted eating can be useful in certain situations. So there are a few more things that you may want to consider, but I would still do exactly what you're doing, Kanchan, and treat them just as, quote unquote, normal people, which they are. And then if you come into any extra barriers, like you find that they're maybe more hungry, or you find that that maybe they're struggling with fertility or something, then that would be something to consider. Where do you access your science? PubMed. Yeah, some stuff on PubMed, yes, is probably the best place. Okay. Right, let me get up the next one. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say on cortisol. But basically, the take home is most people talking about it are just trying to sell you a solution to a problem that you probably don't have. So I would avoid. Another question I'm getting loads, and I think it's because Davina McCall is like the face of them or something, is, again, collagen, but also the other supplements that, I don't even know if I should say their name, but anyway, Ancient and Brave sell. One of them is just collagen, which I've gone over numerous times, so I won't go back into right now, but the short version is massively overhyped. They weirdly have this study on their site that is funded by them and not published, and shows that everybody who took collagen got a benefit from it, which should be a bit of a red flag. And then the other interesting thing that I found when I looked into their supplements is they're quite underdosed. Most of the research on collagen would be something like 5 to 10 grams a day, whereas, unless I got this wrong, it looked to me like the serving size was 2 grams, which is small, and I would highly doubt would have any benefit, really, and they're very expensive supplements. The other interesting supplement was the vegan collagen, because you can't actually have vegan collagen. So I don't know exactly what's in it. I think it's basically just protein that they've called collagen, I think, or it's amino acids that they've called collagen. But obviously, collagen itself is an animal product, so you couldn't actually have vegan collagen. So again, it's just marketing. And if you were thinking, right, well, how do I get the benefits of collagen? Well, anyone, whether you're vegan or not, I'd just be consuming protein and then probably vitamin C if you're not already getting in very much vitamin C. But most people, if they just eat a bit more fruit, like you could either supplement with some vitamin C or you could just be like, I'll have an orange with my protein or like a piece of fruit with my protein, and you're probably going to get the vast majority of the benefits. And then their menopause support, which again is like collagen plus something else. It's same kind of thing. It's just promoting something because they can market to a certain audience. So I'd be very dubious of all of those. Yeah, Leanne, you're right. Vegan collagen is not a thing. Okay, what else did we have here? Okay, the other claim that's often made is that fat on your thighs or your hips means that you have like an excessive amount of estrogen. The reality is that although there is some small impact of where you store your body fat based on like your hormonal profile, which we see obviously the opposite of that when people go through the menopause and often put on more fat around their middle. The vast majority of the like where you store body fat comes from genetics as opposed to hormonal changes, especially not within like a normal physiological range. If anyone remembers Charles Poliquin, put in the chat if you don't, just interested to know this, but if anyone remembers that, he kind of had this whole notion that went around the fitness industry of if you do skin folds in certain places, you'll be able to tell what you're deficient in or what your hormonal makeup is. And then obviously off the back of that, sells you a ton of supplements to like fix it. It was really big with Ultimate Performance back in the day. So yeah, does anyone remember that? Yes, Nicola does. Yeah, Kanchan. Any of the old OGs, like yeah, that was around a lot. Anyway, most of that is obviously not true at all. The interesting part about the estrogen dominance and you storing more like fat around your lower body is that there's like an element of truth in that, because women do tend to store more of their body fat around their bum and around their legs. This is actually a good thing because it's a safe place to store body fat as opposed to centrally, where actually that has a much bigger impact on your risk of things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. So storing more fat there is actually a good thing. You wouldn't necessarily want to change it. But if you did want to lose fat in those areas or in your belly, like wherever, I love that this post was like, don't want to store fat in your belly. And then also like, now you don't want to store fat in your bum and your legs. It's like, well, you can't really win. But anyway, fat loss happens systemically. So you cannot choose where that fat comes from. And I actually pulled out 2 studies on this that I'll try and find, because no matter how many times you go over this, and Chloe and I laugh about this quite a lot, like obviously we don't mind answering these questions, right? And I kind of get why people ask them, partly because there's so much misinformation online that it does confuse people. But normally we'll get a question that's something along the lines of, I know you can't spot reduce like belly fat, or I know you can't spot reduce fat, but how do I lose fat specifically from X area? And again, like the truth is you can't. So what you can do is you can build muscle in that area and it might look leaner, but from a fat loss perspective, it's systemic, right? So one study that looked at this was done on abdominal training. So there's often people think that if you do loads of crunches, you're going to get, ripped around the middle, you're going to get 6-pack abs, or you'll suddenly lose a load of fat from your middle. Sadly, that didn't happen, and there was no impact of training your abdominals on your quote unquote belly fat or abdominal fat. Abdominal subcutaneous fat, if you want to be precise. And then the other study that I thought was quite interesting on the way that this was designed is that they had participants train one leg only, and the fat loss was the same on both legs, whether they were training that leg or not. So again, quite interesting that, well, it's not really interesting. It just proves the point that you can't target where you're losing body fat from. I have seen more and more talk of women being low in testosterone. I feel that's becoming a new trend. Yeah, and again, I bet, because I've seen some of this too, it's things like using really normal emotions like, are you ever tired? Do you ever feel like you just can't be bothered? Do you ever feel like you're not recovering? Do you ever forget things? Are you ever irrationally grumpy? It's like, yes, so is everyone. Well, guess what? You probably have low testosterone. And the thing is, some people probably do, right, and might benefit, but the vast majority probably don't, and don't allow yourself to be diagnosed with a problem you probably don't have by some random person on the internet. Like, if you are genuinely worried, then you need to go and speak to your doctor and you need to get proper testing, as opposed to just listening to a list of very, very common symptoms. And we see the same thing happening with things like ADHD. Like, a lot of the things that people with ADHD struggle with are also just like normal human traits that people struggle with. And then you get a lot of self-diagnosis because of that. And that can be problematic in itself. And I mean, sometimes it's somewhat harmless, but sometimes it really puts like barriers up to people for doing stuff like, oh, I couldn't do that because I've got ADHD, or I can't do this, or if you truly believe that the reason that you can't lose fat is because you're stressed and you have high cortisol, or because you're, I don't know, low in testosterone or something, it's taking it out of your control. So then the most likely thing to happen, well, you'll be thinking, well, if I can't do it anyway because of this hormone imbalance, then there's no point trying. And then what does happen is you end up exercising less, eating more, and finding that like it's become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy because of that belief that you have. Or spending a load of money on supplements that don't work anyway. Without obviously anyone checking if they are low in testosterone, and then influencer/bodybuilding coach fixing testosterone and other hormone imbalances. Yes, Kanchan, absolute classic. And this post that I'm kind of getting a lot of these myths from is, again, selling you, I will fix your hormones for you. Yeah. What's kind of interesting about that is your hormones tend to kind of fix themselves when you become lean, fit, and healthy, which is one of the reasons that some of these myths are quite hard to debunk. So, for example, I could say like, I have this like hormone rebalancing program that's going to help you with your insulin levels, right? Now that would be true because I'd just have people eating in a deficit if they were overweight and reducing body fat levels, which is going to increase insulin sensitivity. And I'd have people resistance train again that would have the same outcome, right? So in that sense, I could be like, I've rebalanced your hormones. But it's a bit misleading to kind of say that, or you need to do it in a very specific way. It's like, actually, being lean, fit, and healthy will allow your body to kind of balance its own hormones, unless you have something else that's going on that would then I'd be suggesting that you speak to a doctor. There is a buzz at the moment about insulin resistance. You could be overweight but not insulin resistant. You can be overweight and not insulin resistant, and a lot of this is genetic. You can actually not be overweight and insulin resistant as well, and not that this is fair, but tends to be that South Asians get an increased risk of things like insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes at a much lower BMI than Caucasian people, for example. So there is like a genetic element to this, and some people are just kind of somewhat lucky. The other thing to consider is that we generally don't test for insulin resistance. You'll likely find out that you're somewhat insulin resistant when your blood glucose levels, so normally it would be fasting blood glucose levels, are elevated. And that's quite far on. So you may have insulin resistance before then. In fact, you would have insulin resistance before then. And I don't want to get like too into this, but it is science versus bullshit. So that's what you're here for. So I'll go into it. But basically what happens when type 2 diabetes progresses is that initially you will be becoming insulin resistant, but you probably won't know about it, because what happens is your body will just produce more insulin. So what previously the amount of insulin that would have cleared your blood glucose to a healthy range, you now need more insulin. And it's only when your body can't keep up with that demand that you start to see your glucose levels creep up, because your body can't produce enough insulin to clear the glucose levels. And that's when you'll probably start to know. So there'll be lots of people that seem on a blood test healthy that may be pre-diabetic, for example, or may have like some level of insulin resistance. It's just that it's not really come to fruition yet. So a lot of people who are overweight, especially if you've only been overweight for, I don't know, if you're quite young, then the insulin resistance won't have developed to the point that your body can't keep up with it anymore. And so you won't see like elevated fasting glucose levels, for example. But if you did another kind of test, like a test specifically for insulin resistance, which they tend not to do because it's very hard to test for insulin, you need to run assays on the blood, as opposed to glucose, which is actually very easy and you can do from a finger prick. Or the other thing that I quite like this as a test, but again, outside of research, not many people do this, is your oral glucose tolerance test. So that means that you'd be given a certain amount of glucose, and then basically your glucose is tracked over time to see how long it takes for it to both peak and then come down. So it's basically testing how tolerant you are of glucose, or how able you are to deal with a glucose load. But yeah, I don't know exactly, Sarah, where like what the context of this is, but yes, you can absolutely be overweight and not insulin resistant. You can also be overweight and pretty fit. It's just that most people aren't. And that's a general statement, but yeah, you could be overweight. And again, it depends how you're classifying overweight. If you're literally just looking at BMI, then I'm willing to bet there are loads of rugby players and athletes that are technically overweight, but also very insulin sensitive. Yeah, so if you have any other questions on that, or that doesn't explain it well enough, let me know, Sarah. As a South Asian, I can fully attest to this. I know a lot of South Asians who are lean and insulin resistant. Yeah, it's not fair, but unfortunately that is what happens. And the main reason for that is genetically, you store more of your body fat viscerally at any body fat level, which again is not fair and somewhat annoying, and just means you need to like work harder to stay fit and healthy. But yeah, you store more fat around your organs, which means that you develop insulin resistance quicker. So that is somewhat annoying, and it's mad. I still remember at university looking at this, and we did a little, I think it must still be there. If you go to the British Heart Foundation website, there's like a test that you can take that you just basically put in risk factors, and it will tell you like your risk factor for cardiovascular disease, for example. So it'd be things like, how much do you smoke? Do you drink? How much do you drink? Do you smoke? How active are you? What's your BMI? Like a couple of things like this, like lifestyle factors. And it's really unfair that like you can, as like a white person, you can be doing a lot of the wrong things and still have a lower risk than someone who's genetically predisposed to have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Okay, well, this kind of links, because the next claim that was made is lower body fat means insulin resistance. Sorry, lower belly fat. Oh, right. I'm reading that wrong. As usual by me. Lower belly fat, as in like fat on your lower belly, I think, means insulin resistance. And again, this is another huge oversimplification. Visceral fat, so inside the abdomen, is associated with insulin resistance, but you can't just diagnose insulin resistance from like looking at somebody or looking at where their body fat levels are. And you often can't see visceral fat, which is the other thing. So you might have someone who looks on the outside quite lean, but is storing quite a lot of visceral fat. And one of the most crude ways you can kind of tell is like if someone has quite like a big but hard belly, it's more likely it's visceral fat. If you have like kind of soft wobbly belly, that's mostly subcutaneous fat, so fat under your skin, and that's actually a much safer place to store fat because it's not around your organs. But yeah, you can't just diagnose things like insulin resistance by just looking at someone. So I went to brunch today. Not even a boozy brunch. It was just like mildly loud where I was, and I've like lost my voice. I have such a weak voice. If I do more than like one speaking thing a day, it just goes. Okay, right. Next one coming up. To reduce belly fat from cortisol, you need to lower stress and avoid high intensity exercise. I touched on this a little bit when I was talking about cortisol before, but I'm very passionate about this one because often women who could benefit the absolute most from things like HIIT training are told to avoid it. And by that, I'm talking about perimenopausal women, postmenopausal women, women with type 2 diabetes, women with PCOS, all of those situations where insulin resistance is often higher. So you absolutely do not need to avoid high intensity interval training. And a lot of the claims around this are because people will say, well, cortisol's already high because you're stressed. What you don't want to do is add more stress to that. And what they don't really realize, or maybe just blindly ignore, I don't know, it is that cortisol spikes during exercise are temporary, required for performance because they mobilize energy, and are completely part of the body's normal response and adaptation process to any stress it's put under, right? So exercise is a stress on the body, and the whole way that we adapt to exercise is it feels the stress, and then we adapt so that next time your body is under that stress, it can deal with it better. Like that's literally what exercise and getting fitter is in a very simplistic way. So you actually actively want a cortisol spike during exercise because it's cortisol's job to then mobilize energy so you can use it. So it mobilizes stored energy, whether that's glucose or fatty acids or even a little bit of amino acids, so that you can actually fuel the exercise that you're doing. It also does things like increases focus, increases alertness, reduces inflammation. And then I already mentioned this, but the really cool studies on people who exercise and then experience like psychological stress and how much better they're able to deal with that. So cortisol only really becomes a problem when it's chronically elevated. So outside of training, not when it should be elevated because of a stressful stimulus. Like that's a good thing for cortisol to behave in that way. And it's kind of similar to the demonization of insulin as well. Like you want an increase in insulin after you eat, right? This is the whole reason that type 1 diabetics who don't produce insulin at all or don't produce enough insulin need to inject insulin. Like this is a good thing. But what you don't want is the chronically elevated levels. So you could think about cortisol as kind of a similar thing. Like you want that immediate response to something when it's stressful. Like you want the cortisol increase. And also you wouldn't be waking up in the morning without an increase in cortisol. That's literally what gets you up. And when you eat something, you also want this increase in insulin. It's just you want these things to also come back down again so there's not this chronically elevated levels. Can anyone ever know they're actually insulin resistant based on what you were just saying? Yeah, you can get tests. So there's a HOMA IR test that you can do. They rarely do outside of research because the relevance of it is quite small. You know, so like a lot of the time, I'm trying to think of a situation, that's why I'm pausing, where it actually would be really useful to know. And maybe in lean phenotype PCOS, but I don't know that the knowledge of that would really change anything. Maybe people would be put on metformin. I'm not 100% sure. but like having worked in type 2 diabetes, like it's not really something that you need to know. What would probably be more interesting is seeing how they respond to glucose, which is going to tell you, like, in a real world situation, what's happening when they eat something. And again, the outcome would be very similar, whether it's that you need to be on certain medication or whether it's that you need to get leaner, reduce body fat, which is going to increase insulin sensitivity, start resistance training, start moving, particularly after meals, because that helps with the clearance of glucose independently of insulin as well. But yes, you can, in answer to your question, yes, you can test for this. Okay, Leanne, I know we can't spot reduce fat, obs, but does visceral fat take longer to lose than subcutaneous fat? Just curious, as it's something that scares me. No, it doesn't necessarily take longer. And this is a slight caveat. So very good question. There is research that shows that if you exercise, I didn't do the study, but there were two groups of people. One of them created a calorie deficit only through diet. The other one created a calorie deficit through diet and exercise. And the exercise group lost more visceral fat, even though the size of the deficit was the same. So it does seem to be that exercise will help you reduce visceral fat more than just a calorie deficit alone. So that'd be one like slight caveat to the you can't spot reduce fat type thing. But when I say that, I'm kind of talking about subcutaneous fat. Like, you can't choose if it comes from your arms or your legs or your belly or whatever. It would have to develop to the point fasting glucose is high and you're tested for this rather than insulin resistance. For the vast majority of people, you won't actually know that you're insulin resistant until you see an issue with your fasting glucose levels, because that's normally what the doctor will test for. But the signs are often there beforehand. Like, if you're very overweight and inactive, then the likelihood is that at some point you would get to the point that this is going to start to become a problem. But part of the issue is it takes years and years and years to get there. It's not like you become overweight and you're insulin resistant overnight. Like, for a long time, your body does keep up with it because it's fucking amazing at staying in this like very homeostatic range. So it will keep your glucose levels very tight, which is why you never fall into a coma between meals, right? So if you eat something, and it will always keep your glucose in a range, whether you eat something or not. That's why you break down glucose from your liver in between meals to keep glucose level high enough, because your brain needs glucose. And again, that's something that's really misunderstood as well, because people are like, oh, your brain needs glucose, it needs a constant supply, so you should never cut carbs and you should always be eating all the time. It's like, no, your body is fucking great. Like, it can also produce glucose from amino acids if it needs to. Like, it doesn't even need you to consume carbs. Like, you could technically, wouldn't recommend, but you could technically go carb free. And, a lot of people do on ketogenic diets and things, and they may have some issues, but most of them aren't falling into comas. What sort of exercise actually fits into the category of HIIT? Again, good question. And the definition of HIIT varies depending on who you talk to. Some people deem HIIT training as like a spin class. Some people are like, no, it has to be like absolutely max out training. And if anyone says you're doing HIIT for a whole hour, then, you're lying to yourself or whatever. This is quite individual, because when you actually look at the research on HIIT, most of it is relatively long. So when I was researching in this area, I think most of the protocols were something like 10 1-minute bouts. So quite long, like 1 minute on, 1 minute off type thing, quite long. And then you have a subcategory of that called SIT training, which is sprint interval training, which is maybe what a lot of the more kind of, I don't know, elitist HIIT training people think of HIIT training is like, it should be a max out sprint. That research is really interesting. And this is where I think it's so important, especially if you're someone who doesn't like exercise or who can't exercise very much. Such a small amount of exercise can increase insulin sensitivity. So one incredible study on this, in fact, there's a group that do a lot of studies on SIT training, and they showed that even 2 bouts of 10-second exercise was enough to increase insulin sensitivity. which is mad. So it does have to be absolutely flat out, right? And you can only really replicate this on the kind of bikes that they use in the labs. So if you're doing sit training in a lab, what tends to happen is you're on a bike that probably looks similar to a spin bike, but instead of slowly cranking up the gears, they get you to go quite fast and then they drop the weight on. So you immediately are at this very, very high intensity. And that's why you can get such a push from like 10 seconds. And then for some reason, and I think it's something to do with the blood flow, you need to do 2. So like just doing 20 seconds for some reason doesn't really work. It's like there has to be 2 bouts, or that's what, I mean, I haven't looked deep into this research for about 5 years, but at that point, like that was the belief behind it, that it was something to do with blood flow to the muscle. So you want to do like 2 really hard bouts. Now, I would say if you're trying to replicate something like that, you would need to do longer because you're not going to have the same equipment available and you're not going to be pushed to the same extreme. But yeah, that's a really good question, Anita, because it's not that well defined. And HIIT training to one person in their head might be very different to HIIT training to another person. What's your thoughts on intermittent fasting? Is there really any benefit, or can it add more stress on the body? I'd be less worried about the stress on the body. I think as humans, we're pretty adapted to spending quite large periods of time without eating. And we're probably way more resilient than most people give credit. Like I think sometimes the kickback for things like intermittent fasting or fasting in general is like, a woman's body should never be put under extra stress, especially when she's perimenopausal, or especially when she's, in a luteal phase or some fucking crap like that. And you just think, you do know that like until relatively recently, there would be large periods of time where like you would not be eating, and then you'd have to sprint to catch prey or something. Like you weren't always like covered in cotton wool and could eat at every single available time. And the argument now is probably more like, what's your preference and what do you feel best doing? But are you absolutely able to exercise fasted? Yeah. Are you absolutely able to intermittently fast? Yeah. If you're like, do you know what? I feel like it adds stress to my body or adds stress to my life, or I really don't enjoy it, that's one thing. But to say like women especially are like physiologically incapable of that is just like, we would literally be extinct by now. It doesn't make any sense to claim that. And biologically, from like an evolutionary standpoint, we've really not changed that much in the last like couple of 100 years in terms of how your actual biology works. Probably not at all, right? Evolution takes a long time. And we're absolutely able to go for periods of time without eating. Now, my own thoughts on intermittent fasting, I really like it as a way to manage calories. I think for most people that works really well. If you're someone who struggled with things like binge eating, it's probably not a good thing for you to be doing. If you find that you respond badly to it, it's probably not a good thing for you to be doing. You're not really missing out on anything. The vast majority of the benefits of intermittent fasting have been shown to come from calorie restriction, not the fact that you're intermittently fasting. One of the only caveats for this I've already spoken about, which is PCOS, where like even lean people can have insulin resistance. And there does seem to be a significant benefit from just changing when you're eating. And this isn't so much to do with fasting, it's more the placement of the highest calorie meals of your day, or when you're eating the most calories. And a large reason for that is probably that if you eat most of your calories in the morning and then you're moving around all day, guess what? You can clear the glucose much quicker, even independently of insulin, as opposed to if you eat your large evening meal and then you sit in front of the couch all day and then you go to bed. Like that's going to be one of the fundamental differences. We also have a slight circadian rhythm in relation to how well we manage glucose. So tends to peak for most people at about 12. This will be different for everyone's kind of chronobiology, but about midday is when you're most likely to be able to handle glucose the best or be most insulin sensitive. But for most people, it doesn't really matter because a far bigger impact is going to be, when did you last train? Are you active at that point? Like the person who goes to the gym at lunchtime is going to be far more insulin sensitive than the person that sits at their desk at lunchtime. and then trains later on, right? So there'll be like so many confounding variables to this. But that might be one thing. And then I just think anecdotally, I found I really like intermittent fasting for other reasons. So sometimes like I would call it just not eating between meals as opposed to intermittent fasting per se. But I think having periods of time where you're not eating and then you're not thinking about food as much, and actually you get a lot more done and you concentrate better and you're not distracted. And then one thing I really like about it, especially for smaller people who have less calories to play with, is you can actually eat big meals, right? So if you're someone who's, I don't know, followed some bodybuilder, or they're like, oh, I'm going to eat 6 meals a day or even like 5 meals a day, but you're only on 1,400 calories and trying to be in a deficit. Why did I pick 1,400? Because what's the maths on that? Let's see. Calculator. 1,400 divide 6. 233 calories a meal. That's not fun. Now, what would 1,400 divide 5? 280. 1,400. Sure, this is great for everyone. Yeah, but if you had 3 meals a day, it's like close to 466 calories a meal or whatever. But then if you kind of sway that a little bit, like I don't mind having a slightly smaller lunch. I like to have a bigger breakfast, bigger dinner, smaller lunch. Then it's like, okay, you can actually have decent sized meals, even on low calories. But if you're trying to eat frequently, then actually what you find is like you're sitting down with your family to have an evening meal, and like you can have a little bit of cucumber and like, I don't know, 1 bite of the chicken that you've made or something, and like that's all you've got left. Like that's not a fun way to live. So there is arguments for and against different frequencies of eating. And I mean, intermittent fasting, depending on the protocol that you're using, might be a bit of an extreme. But even if you look at what most people do, which is like eating from say 11 till, I don't know, when do people normally, is it 11:08? I think it is, isn't it? But anyway, even if it was like 11 until your evening meal, whenever that might be, you basically just pushed breakfast back a little bit. Like it's not a big deal. And often that helps people stick to their diets. Now, if you're someone who finds that they're training in the morning and they really want to optimize body composition and they train at 6 a.m. and then they're like, but I don't eat anything until 11 a.m. and you've done a whole night obviously not eating during the night, and then you train in the morning and then you're not eating until 11, I would suggest doing something like having a protein shake or something. If you really don't want to eat anything, or just being like, do you know what, intermittent fasting doesn't really work for me in that manner, so I'm not going to do it. And by the way, I've got really lean and clients really lean by intermittent fasting, by not intermittent fasting. So it's definitely not something that you have to do, but if it serves you and you enjoy it, why not? What's your go-to recommendation / non-negotiables for women who are perimenopausal and or menopausal who have gained fat around the middle and want to try and reduce weight? So obviously we've covered this a few times so far. You will systemically lose fat. So in regards to like that area specifically, there's nothing different that you would need to do than premenopause, for example, apart from maybe speak to your doctor if you do want to take HRT, because that will also impact slightly where you store body fat as well. If it's the drop in estrogen that's making you store more fat centrally, then obviously replacing some of that would have an impact on that. And then this is probably going to be somewhat unpopular, but like I'm saying this because it's the truth, right? There's not really a huge difference, and loads of people will market to you and sell you on the fact that there is, and sell you their very specific menopause program or specific supplements for it, but the fundamentals are exactly the same. What helped you lose fat before menopause is exactly the same as during or post menopause. It is still a calorie deficit. Is it harder? Yes. Does it feel like it's completely different, or that the things that you did before aren't working anymore? Yes, probably, but it's not because your physiology is different. It's probably because of the symptoms that you're struggling with. Or more to the point there, it's not because your fat loss physiology is different. Your physiology might have changed. Your symptoms might have changed. You might be sleeping less. You might have more stress going on. You might be struggling with hot flushes. You might be experiencing low mood and low motivation, and all of those things have a huge impact on your weight. But it's not that the calorie deficit doesn't work anymore. And all of the things I've just mentioned mean that often the approach that you were taking before isn't the same as the approach you were taking now. And you'll find that maybe before you needed to put in a little bit of effort and you could just lose weight. Or you're maybe someone who never really struggled with their weight, and it's only now that you're starting to struggle with your weight. Okay, so what was working for you before, you're right, doesn't work for you anymore. But from a very like practical standpoint, like don't get sucked into these like gimmicks and things. Like it's still a calorie deficit. It's just the way that we coach you in order to achieve that calorie deficit might be different. And hey, maybe you will want to do intermittent fasting, or maybe you will want to have more frequent meals when actually previously you enjoyed intermittent fasting, or maybe you want to go on a lower carb diet, which actually I'm a huge fan of because it tends to make people less hungry and find that actually sticking to a deficit is a little bit easier the vast majority of the time. Again, it's not for everyone, but any good coach will listen to you, listen to your symptoms, help you with those, and then find an approach that actually works for you and your life situation at the time. So my advice would be get an excellent coach. I am available for said role. And if you do want to apply for coaching, head over to esgfitness.co.uk, fill in the application form, and I will email you, or just message me on Instagram if you just want to have a little casual chat. But the application form on the website is definitely the best way because DMs get lost, and it means I've got like a bit of information about you. So then I can see if I'm the right person to help you, or maybe somebody else is, and I can refer you to them. I'm thinking along the lines of BMR. I've always thought you need to be above BMR, but intermittent fasting could put you below this. That's not true that you need to be above BMR. In fact, there's, a very extreme study of a man who didn't eat for, I can't remember how many, maybe it was a whole year. Anyway, for a very long time. And guess what? Lost fat, was fine. Not something, obviously, an extreme I wouldn't recommend. There'll be a lot of people on Mounjaro and Ozempic who are eating significantly below their basal metabolic rate. So that I don't know where that really comes from, but I wouldn't generally suggest someone who's not on weight loss drugs to have a massive deficit because they won't be able to sustain it, and they'll probably be very grumpy and they miss out on social events. And then even if they do end up losing the weight and sticking to it for long enough, they don't really know how to keep that weight off, and they kind of swing between these very restrictive diets and then swing back the other way and end up putting on all the weight again. So there are various reasons that you wouldn't drop calories too low, but specifically being below your basal metabolic rate isn't the reason for that. Hopefully that makes sense. And I'm going to wrap that up so that everyone can go and enjoy their Sundays. I hope people have enjoyed this. If you do enjoy this format, please do give me feedback. Let me know, because if you enjoy it, I will keep doing it. If not, I'll just go back to podcast. And if there are any things like specifically that you want me to cover, send them away and I'll make sure that I cover them. And thanks to the people that are here and that ask the questions. It makes it way more exciting for me. And I really enjoy doing these, and hopefully people get a ton of value out of them, stop falling for fads, and feel empowered to take action and put their focus in the right places that's actually going to get them results. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.